The nuclear guardrails are about to disappear. In less than a year, the world crosses a line it hasn't crossed since the Cold War. On February 4th, 2026, the last treaty limiting US and Russian nuclear weapons expires. That sounds procedural. It's not. It means the two largest nuclear arsenals on Earth could operate with no binding limits at all. But here's the paradox. Even now, officials say nothing has changed. They say restraint still exists, yet the systems that made restraint real are already gone. Inspections stopped, data exchanges went dark, trust didn't erode slowly, it snapped. What's left is something far more fragile, voluntary self-control between rivals who no longer verify each other. That's not stability, that's hope. And this matters to you because nuclear planning doesn't wait for headlines. When limits vanish, worst-case thinking takes over. Budgets change, postures shift, timelines compress, decisions get faster and riskier. This isn't just about one treaty ending. It's about what replaces rules when there are none. And the most dangerous part isn't the expiration itself. It's what quietly starts happening before anyone admits it. What's unfolding here didn't start in 2026. It's the endpoint of a longer breakdown that's been happening in plain sight. The treaty was supposed to be extended, reinforced, or replaced. Instead, it's been hollowed out from the inside. By early 2023, participation was suspended, inspections stopped. The machinery that kept both sides honest was effectively turned off. Officially, the limits still existed. Functionally, they didn't. Now notice the pattern. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow downgrade. First, verification paused, then communication thinned, then negotiations stalled. Each step was framed as temporary. Each one reduced friction just enough to feel manageable. But together they point in one direction, a system designed to constrain power being allowed to expire without a backup. Here's the key reframing question. If the world's most destructive weapons are no longer governed by enforceable rules, what replaces predictability? Because treaties don't just cap numbers. They shape expectations. They tell planners what the other side can't do. When that certainty fades, strategy shifts from planning within limits to preparing for extremes. And here's where the story starts to widen. This isn't only about two countries or one document. It's about whether the nuclear order itself is quietly being retired without anyone voting on it. The strongest claim here is simple but unsettling. The world is already living in a post-treaty reality, even though the treaty still technically exists. And the evidence is hiding in what stopped happening. There are no inspectors traveling, no on-site visits, no shared databases updating force levels. Those mechanisms weren't symbolic. They were the enforcement layer. Once they were suspended, the treaty became a statement of intent rather than a system of control. Here's the detail that changes how you see it. The limits didn't disappear first, the visibility did. And in nuclear strategy, visibility is everything. When you can't confirm what the other side has deployed, you don't plan for what they say, you plan for what they could do. That single shift quietly rewrites military logic. Both sides insist they're still respecting the caps, and maybe they are, but notice what's missing. There's no independent confirmation, no way to separate truth from signaling. Stability is now being maintained by assumption rather than verification. That's a fragile place to stand. This is where the story flips. Arms control doesn't fail with an explosion. It fails with silence, fewer meetings, fewer messages, fewer shared facts. And once that silence sets in, every move starts to look like preparation. Even restraint starts to look suspicious. What happens next is escalation, but not the kind people expect. There's no dramatic announcement, no sudden surge. Instead, something dangerous becomes normal. Operating without inspection starts to feel routine. Planning without confirmed data becomes standard. And once that happens, restraint stops being a rule and starts being a gamble. We've seen this pattern before. When guardrails weaken, military systems don't freeze, they compensate. During earlier periods of arms control collapse, the response wasn't immediate buildup. It was hedging. Extra warheads kept in storage, delivery systems maintained at higher readiness, options preserved just in case. None of that looks aggressive on paper. All of it changes the balance. Here's the part that should feel uncomfortable. The absence of limits doesn't create chaos overnight. It creates normalization. planners begin asking different questions. Not what's allowed, but what's possible. And once possibility replaces permission, expansion becomes rational. This is how arms races restart in modern systems, quietly, through planning documents, budget lines, and readiness postures. By the time the public notices numbers rising, the logic that caused it is already locked in. And this escalation doesn't stay contained, because when one side adjusts for uncertainty, the other side sees threat. That's the moment when restraint stops looking safe. Here's the second proof hit, and it's harder to ignore. Even as leaders talk about restraint, they're preparing for a world without it. The contradiction sits right in the structure of the arsenals. The treaty limits deployed warheads, not total ones. That means thousands of nuclear warheads already exist off the books, stored, maintained, and ready to be loaded if the caps disappear. This is where perception breaks. On paper, nothing has changed. In reality, upload potential becomes the story. Without limits on launches or warheads, both sides can rapidly increase deployed forces without building anything new. No factories, no tests, just decisions. That's what makes this phase so destabilizing. Notice what's not being emphasized publicly. There's no serious discussion about how fast this could happen. The timeline is measured in months, not decades. And that changes everything. Deterrence used to rely on slow, visible shifts. Now it hinges on sudden reversibility. Here's the line that permanently reframes the issue. Arms races used to be about production. This one is about activation. And when activation replaces construction, warning time collapses. At that point, words about stability stop mattering. What matters is who believes they can move first without falling behind. And once that belief takes hold on either side, restraint becomes the risky choice. Now the pressure stacks fast, not with one crisis, but several overlapping at once. The treaty is expiring. Verification is already gone. And at the same time, strategic planning is shifting toward defense systems designed to change the balance. Missile defense moves from a background issue to a central one, and that reactivates an old fear. When one side builds defenses, the other side doesn't feel safer, it feels cornered. Because defense against nuclear weapons only works if offense can be neutralized. So the response isn't patience, it's saturation, more warheads, new delivery paths, systems designed to overwhelm, not deter. Now watch the tempo. Defensive plans accelerate, offensive counters follow, political rhetoric hardens. Each step is justified as stabilizing, each one shortens decision time. Control slips not because someone chooses chaos, but because no one can afford to pause. This is what a mini-crisis looks like in slow motion. No single moment triggers alarm, but pressure accumulates. Options narrow, flexibility disappears, and that leads to the question nobody wants to answer. What happens if this continues unchecked, with no limits, no inspections, and no shared definitions of restraint? At some point, this stops being abstract and starts landing in daily life. Because when nuclear strategy shifts, everything downstream adjusts with it. You don't see warheads. You see budgets. You see priorities change. You see governments spending more on deterrence and less on stability. And that pressure always travels downward. If planning moves toward worst-case scenarios, costs rise. Taxpayers carry that weight. If alert levels increase, miscalculations matter more. A radar glitch, a misread exercise, a delayed message. Those aren't theoretical risks. They're the kinds of failures history is built on, and the margin for error shrinks quietly, without public debate. This also affects how leaders behave in crises. When arsenals are unconstrained and intentions are unclear, restraint looks dangerous, escalation starts to feel like insurance. That mindset doesn't stay confined to nuclear policy. It bleeds into diplomacy, trade, and conflict decisions everywhere else. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because most people don't experience nuclear risk as a headline. They feel it as a constant background tension, an unease that the systems meant to prevent catastrophe are thinning out. And once that feeling sets in, trust becomes harder to rebuild than weapons. What makes this possible isn't recklessness, it's structure. Systems drift toward instability when incentives reward speed, dominance, and leverage instead of restraint. Treaties slow things down. They impose friction. When that friction disappears, power fills the gap. Here's the unsettling mechanism. Nuclear stability used to rely on mutual visibility and shared limits. Now it relies on perception management. Signaling replaces verification. Assumptions replace data. And in competitive systems, assumptions are treated as threats until proven otherwise. That creates a bias toward action. There's also a political incentive. Being seen as unconstrained project strength, flexibility becomes leverage. Limits start to look like self-inflicted weakness. In that environment, restraint requires justification, while expansion doesn't. The system quietly rewards whoever moves first and punishes whoever waits. This is why outrage misses the point. The danger isn't bad actors. It's a framework that no longer filters fear out of decision-making. When leaders operate inside that framework, escalation isn't emotional, it's rational. That's what makes this moment more dangerous than it looks. The system no longer asks whether something is stabilizing, it asks whether it's survivable. And that shift changes everything that comes next. From here, the path forward splits, and neither option is clean. One path is managed instability. Informal restraint holds. Limits are respected without enforcement. Communication channels stay open just enough to prevent panic. This path looks calm on the surface, but it depends on perfect signaling and constant self-control. One misread move and it collapses. The other path is open competition. Uploads begin, delivery systems expand, defensive and offensive technologies race each other. Each side insists it's responding, not provoking. In this scenario, escalation doesn't need intent. Momentum does the work. Once expansion starts, stopping looks like weakness. Notice the uncertainty. There's no clear trigger for either outcome. The system is already leaning. What decides the direction could be something small. A crisis elsewhere, a political shift, a technological breakthrough. The next move might not even be labeled nuclear. What's clear is that time no longer stabilizes this situation. It destabilizes it. The longer limits remain absent, the harder they are to restore. And that means whatever happens next isn't a reset. It's a commitment, whether anyone admits it or not. There's one insight that ties this entire story together. Nuclear order doesn't collapse with a launch. It collapses with permission. Permission to plan without limits. Permission to assume the worst. Permission to treat restraint as optional. For decades, treaties didn't eliminate danger. They contained it. They slowed decisions. They made intentions legible. Once that structure disappears, the system doesn't become more honest. It becomes more anxious. And anxious systems don't wait. This entire episode is often framed as a failure of diplomacy. That misses the deeper point. It's a failure of maintenance. Stability requires constant upkeep. When that work stops, decay doesn't announce itself. It just spreads. What happens after 2026 won't look dramatic at first. It will look technical, quiet, boring, until suddenly it isn't. If you want to understand how power systems actually break and what replaces them when they do, follow and subscribe. Because this story doesn't end with a treaty expiring. It continues with the choices made once nothing is enforcing restraint anymore.